So glad to be here with you guys again. I'm not DJ, I'm Steve. I'm shorter, I'm browner, I'm more Asian than DJ. I'm Filipino. But yeah, I look a lot different. But he and Alicia had a much needed vacation they needed to go on. So they're on a family vacation with, I think, Alicia's grandparents in Mammoth. So I just want to ask Piper, if she's excited to go on the lake. She said, we're gonna ride a giant weenie. And I was like, oh, that's strange. And so I was like, oh, it's an inflatable hot dog. That's cool. Yeah, so she was really excited about that to go on there. But so that's good. You could pray for their time recreation and recuperation for them and for DJ. He's been hard at work here. Yeah, you guys probably used to me leading the music part and song, which I love, and just rare times I get to kind of teach from the Bible and from God's Word. So I'm excited to go into this today. But just to kind of move things along, we're in the parables. We're focusing on Jesus sharing different parables, and we're going to look at Luke 18, 9 through 14. It's a very short story, but there's a lot packed into there. So I'm going to do my best to kind of move along. My wife is kind of like, just keep going. Okay, I'll do my best. Okay. This is kind of start us off. So some of you might know, before we started this church here 5 years ago in Studio City, all of us in the leadership team used to work for a Christian organization called Crew. It was called Campus Crusade for Christ. And it was about working with college students to help them grow in their relationship with God and with their faith, and help them to share this message of the gospel to fellow students in their campuses. And so we worked primarily in college campuses. And so we used different tools. We had different spiritual interest surveys. And so there were like about 5 or 6 questions on there. And so when we would talk with college students on campus, we would use this to kind of engage with people there about what they believed in, where they were at. And so one of the questions we would ask is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how sure are you that you would go to heaven? And so 10 being absolutely sure, 1 being like, I have no idea. And so some people would, they would rank themselves pretty high. So they probably say a 7 or 8. Few would actually say 10, but typically a 7 or 8, they would place themselves. And then I would ask a follow-up question, would be, so why would you place yourself as a 7 or 8? And they would say, well, I'm not that bad of a person. I haven't murdered anybody. I haven't stolen anything. I haven't done that many bad things. So, I'm a pretty good person. And so, lived a pretty good life. So I was like, okay, that's pretty good. And so I think that was typical answers that we would get. So those were some of the conversations we would be into. One particular conversation I had was some of you might know, we were at the University of Arizona doing ministry there. And there was one student in particular. I was at the student union going through a similar survey. And then we transitioned into talking about the gospel and got into a booklet about how to have a relationship with God. And so I got into talking about forgiveness. And as I was talking about forgiveness, he just started looking down. And then he bowed his head a little bit lower. And I was like, this is kind of strange. He stopped having eye contact with me. I was like, this is kind of weird. And I was like, okay, I'll just keep talking. Eventually, I hear him sniffling. And then I noticed there were tear drops falling onto the table, and he was just crying. And I was like, okay. So I immediately stopped, and I said, hey, just want to check in with you. How's everything going? Like, are you okay? And he was like, can you move closer? And I was like, okay. And I was like, all right. And so I scooped my chair a little bit closer, and he's like, I just don't want everybody here. It was a pretty busy place, student union. There's a lot of people walking around there in college campuses, if you've been to a college campus. So I was like, okay. So I'm really close to him. I'm like, pretty much like this, like right there. Here's his face, here's my face. And I was like, getting kind of close, right? So, tears in his eyes, just, like, I was like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And he's like, Steve, can God really forgive me? I was like, yeah, dude, like, he absolutely can. He's like, but I've done something really terrible. Like, I just don't think he can forgive me. I was like, well, would you mind sharing that with me? He was like, okay. He said, so I've been dating this girl for about a year. And a few months ago, we found out that we were pregnant. And so we were in school, and I just got accepted to go to med school, and we felt like this wasn't a good thing, to keep this baby. So we decided to have an abortion. And he's like, as he was saying, he could barely keep it together. And he was just broken over that decision. And he talked about how he wasn't sure about the decision, how he was wrestling it with his girlfriend, but he felt like that was the best thing for them. And he was just utterly broken over making that decision. And he's like, God could never forgive me for that. And I sat back in my chair, and I knew what I was going to say next was going to have a profound impact in his life. So I will get to that later. But before I get there, when we look at people, we're in a pretty progressive city. And I don't know where even people's stances in terms of even that specific issue with abortion and stuff. But, God does value life. He loves children, as we heard earlier from Becky's story. He loves all life from womb to tomb. He values all of life. And so there's this specific view in that isn't popular, we know, in our city. But for him, he knew that was something that God could never forgive him for. And usually people will have such guilt and shame, and we're probably in that position of guilt and shame, or like most people be, oh, no, I'm pretty good. I'm a morally good person. I give to charity. I help out as much as I can. And so I think most people, even here, would probably put themselves in one of those two categories. What's amazing about that is that Jesus has something to say about that, wherever you're at. And that's the great thing about this story with the Pharisee and the tax collector, is because he addresses those two issues and those two spiritual states. And so we're going to look at that. So I'm going to read it, and then we'll go dive into that. So Luke 18:9-14 is what it says. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. This is the word of the Lord. So what's good about when you look at these parables is to understand kind of the context of what is going on. And so Jesus is traveling in a few chapters before, no, not a few chapters, one chapter before, a few verses before. He's traveling from Samaria to Galilee on his way to Jerusalem. And so he's telling different stories and parables to different people, from Pharisees to his disciples. And so that was his journey at that point. So he's making his way to Jerusalem. And during this time, it says here in the first verse in chapter 18, verse 9, he says, he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. So right away, we know who his audience was. And so it's good to kind of know when he tells these parables, who is he talking to? As we looked at the different series in the parables, he was definitely directing them to a specific people. And for here, it was people who trusted in themselves, that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. And so righteousness, when you think about righteous, it's actually not a bad thing, right? Who doesn't want to be righteous? I mean, really, if the dictionary definition of someone who's righteous is acting in accordance with divine or moral law, free from guilt or sin. So, yeah, you're a morally good person, right? If you're a righteous person, you do good things, right? That's not a bad thing, right? So the opposite of righteousness would then be wickedness, evil, right? Morally bad. So that's bad. So it kind of Those are two bad things. But you kind of get a sense here that there's something wrong about these people, right? And in terms of their view of righteousness. There's a commentary when I was reading up on righteousness, and specifically for the Israelites and for Jewish people. Being a righteous person is a high value. It's really indicative of who they were and in their identity. And this is what it says. It says, in Israel, the concept of righteousness transformed all of life, both religious and secular. Israel had been called into existence as a separate nation through which Yahweh God was to witness to the nations concerning his universal rule, his nature, and his expectations of life on the earth. This meant that Israel required a revelation from God so that they might learn his will and be instructed in maintaining a relationship with him. The quality of a person's relationship with God is directly linked to his relationship with his fellow man. God is righteous. The righteousness of the Lord is a dynamic concept since it describes his acts on behalf of his people and also the nature of his relationship with them. So, for the Israelites and for Hebrew people at that time, for ancient Hebrew, to be righteous was direct reflection upon God being righteous, right? God is a righteous God. Everything he does is good. Everything he does is absolutely good, perfectly good, right? But not only that, it's a direct connection and relationship with his people. So the purpose of righteousness is a covenant relationship between God and his people. And so that is why the motivation for why we do right things, why the Hebrew people held it, was for the purpose. If you read the Torah, if you read the first 5 books of the Old Testament, you will see that the purpose of following his laws and being a good person was to have a covenant relationship between God and them. And so that was at the heart and motivation of righteousness. That's not what describes these people here. He said they trusted in themselves. Their righteousness was based upon them, right? It wasn't about relationship with God. It was about relationship with self. What would make me look good? What would, all the good things that I'm doing, what would elevate me to look better than everybody else? That's why they looked at other people with contempt, right? The Greek word is exuthenian. I took Greek and I still can't pronounce it. But the translation for that is utter contempt, disdain, rejection, disgust. So, you know what they did? So they elevated themselves so highly that they were like, we are the moral examples of our day. Everybody else is poo-poo. That's me being nice. But, they just looked at people with utter disgust and disdain and contempt. They are not as good as we are. They can't touch us. Our righteousness is higher than theirs, right? This is his audience. This is who Jesus was talking to as he enters into the story. So, let's move on. Before that, I think when we think about even today, I think about even me when I think about my relationships. I always think about my relationship with my wife, and she hates it when I do this. So I'm sorry, Dre. I love you. But when we argue and we disagree, naturally in arguments, I want to be right because I like to win, right? I mean, that's usually the motivation is because I'm right, because I'm right. And so whenever we're arguing and we're having a disagreement, it's about me winning. And so my motivation is to not think about what will deepen my relationship with my wife, right? It's not about relationship. It's not the righteousness sense, right? About being right is to deepen the relationship with her. It's about me and what will make me right. And so in some ways, I can really relate to this audience. And so let's keep going. So we look at the parable and we see Jesus, and he's talking to about two characters. He introduces two characters. He talks about a Pharisee and a tax collector. And it says that they're going up into the temple. And so this is a great imagery because when you think about going up somewhere, usually you can think about that that this temple was located on a hill, right? And so the imagery is that where the temple is in Hebrew time, the temple was where God was, right? It was a place of worship. It was the epicenter for all worship and for all prayer for all the people in Israel. So they were going up. And so there's kind of this sense that they were trying to go up closer to where God is. And so they both these characters are trying to be closer to God. You kind of get the imagery as they're walking up. It's kind of subtle. The thing about Luke is that he's a doctor, he's a physician. So he's all about details. And he puts these subtle things in here to make us think and to make us look. And when you read it, it's like, oh, this is an important detail. This is an important imagery that we need to look at. And so when Jesus is telling the story, he's like, oh, these two people want to be closer to God, the Pharisee and the tax collector. Prayer, again, the purpose of why they're going there is to pray, is to worship God. And so for the Pharisee, he wanted to pray, right? And prayer is simply communicating to God. There's nothing magical about it. There's not this seance type thing or magical words. It's just, direct communication. But really what a prayer is, when we're communicating with God, it really reflects upon what is going on in our hearts. And Jesus talks about that. And in here, he really gets into the heart of each character's prayer. And so for the Pharisee, we really see his motivation and his heart and his prayer. So what does he say? He says, the Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like the other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. Again, as we see here at first glance, right? You look at it, you see it, and you go, what's wrong with that? Like if you're an extortioner, that's bad. That's not a bad thing. I don't want to be an extortioner. I don't want to exploit people to make people feel bad. I'm not extorting people to gain something from them. That's a good thing. I want to be a just person. I don't want to be an adulterer. And so those are good motivations to have. Again, but you get a sense here. What is his motivation? What is his desire to not be these things? And so for Pharisees, they really were the moral examples for their day. They were, as some commentators would say, that they were the best moral examples to the Jewish people of their day. So to understand a little bit of the Pharisees' motivation, it's good to understand, where does this come from? Like, why are Pharisees the way they are? Okay, so bear with me, because I might seem like I'm going on a rabbit trail, but I'm not, and I'll bring it back together. So we look back in Deuteronomy 28, okay, and it talks about, this is from the Torah, and this is about where really this is the heart of what my Old Testament professors say are the heart of God's law and his covenant with his people. And so God commands his people and says, if you keep my commandments, I will bless you, right? And this is what he says: if you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments that I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. And all these blessings shall call upon you and overtake you if you obey the voice of the Lord your God. And said he'll bless your city, he'll bless your people, and you get all these great blessings from God. And so if you obey, that's a great motivation, right? If you do what I say, I will bless you, and I will bless you in tremendous ways. And so that was a great motivation to obey God's commands. On the flip side, if you read on, he says, if you disobey, then there's this huge list. I mean, it's a longer list than the blessings. Trust me. If you just go to Deuteronomy 28, and it's pretty long. One of the things he says is this in verses 65 to 66. Excuse me. And the Lord will scatter you among all the peoples from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your fathers have known. And among these nations you shall find no respite, and there shall be no resting place for the sole of your foot, but the Lord will give you a trembling heart and falling eyes and languishing your soul. And so God said, if you disobey me and you worship other gods and you don't do what I command, I'm going to scatter you amongst the face of the earth. I'm going to spread you guys out. I'm going to disband you, basically. And if you remember from what we looked at, I think it was like 6 months ago, however long ago it was, at the story of Israel, that's what happened, right? After David and Solomon, the two kingdoms were divided, with the northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah. Northern kingdom worshiped other gods until they were invaded by Assyria. And then Judah was pretty good for a little bit. And then eventually started worshiping other gods. And then they got invaded by Babylon. So when the invasion happens, they would take their people, they would plunder their cities and their lands, and they would take not only their possessions, but the people too, and take them back to their homeland of Assyria or Babylon. And so the Jewish people were scattered to the face of the earth. Above that, years later, the Persian Empire attacked Babylon, conquered Babylon, and so there was more scattering of Jewish people across the known earth. And so they were being scattered. So God actually fulfilled what he said was going to happen if they disobeyed. During the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, the king of Persia said, you know what, because I'm a great king, I'm going to let you guys go back. I'm going to get you, the temple was destroyed during the invasion of Babylon, and so I'll let you rebuild it. So he let them come back and rebuild it. And then he also allowed them to come back and rebuild the walls, because walls then were ways to defend against intruders, and so they allowed some of the Hebrew people to come back to do that. When that happened and they were able to rebuild, God used that time to kind of restore Israel back to following God's ways, right? Following his laws and his commands. And so Ezra and Nehemiah, they said, you know what? We're no longer going to worship foreign gods. We're no longer going to do this anymore. And so we're not even going to marry foreign women, because if you marry foreign women, that was a representation of worshiping other gods too. So we're not going to do any of that. And so we're going to keep to following the law, because we want to keep his blessing, right? We want God to keep blessing us. That was during that time. That's when some scholars would say where the Pharisees descended from, because from that time, what they did was they started to add on more rules and more regulations upon the Torah covenant. And so they started to do more things to keep them more righteous, to stand out more, so that they can be closer to God and that they can get his blessing. And so we actually see this in the verse where he says, I fast twice a week and I give all tithe. If you look at when they were supposed to fast in the Torah, it was only during the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, is when, only once a year. But because he's so spiritual and he's so righteous, I'm going to do it more. I'm going to layer upon that. And not only that, but I'm going to give all that I have. And it was, again, another Levitical law. They're only, where we get tithing from, they're only supposed to tithe a portion, the best portion of what they have. But because this Pharisee decided, you know what, I'm going to give everything. So even more so than I have. And so Jesus was pointing out in this story that this Pharisee was doing exceedingly more than what God commanded him to do. He was fulfilling his more than the requirements that God asked him to have. Why? Why would you do that? Why would he do that? Because what did he want? Deuteronomy 28. He wanted his blessing. He wanted the blessings that God was supposed to give him. This echoes some of the similar parables in Luke 15. Why did the older brother get upset and show contempt to his father and his younger brother? Because he wanted his father's stuff, right? Why did the lawyer in the Good Samaritan in Luke 10 question Jesus? Because he wanted to justify himself and make him look more righteous than Jesus. You see what I'm saying? It's an issue of the heart. It's what elevates. The Pharisee wanted to elevate himself so highly above even the standard of what God commanded him to be, that he didn't want that covenant relationship anymore. He wanted to look upon his own righteousness to save him. His good deeds was going to make him right with God, right? And so that it ended up that he even wasn't even paying attention to prayer that he even had to look back and say, you know what, that tax collector back there, I'm better than him. I mean, he's not even paying attention to God. He cares more about being better than the other person. Man, that's messed up. I mean, you think about it, right? But don't we do that today? I mean, we do that, in our views on politics, wherever you guys stand, in our views on racial issues. Why is there so much tension still today? Just puffing of our own righteousness and our pride. Even in churches, we do this. I do this. Oh, I go to church every day. I pray, I read my Bible. Oh man, that person doesn't do that. I don't know if he knows Jesus. Man, I need to pray for that person. It sounds spiritual, right? But it's not. It's not spiritual whatsoever. I mean, I'm a pastor. I go to seminary. I have, even in my classes, I'll have people have different theological perspectives than me. And I go, man, that guy is dumb. Person's dumb. And I'm like, what in the world is this person thinking? And you know what I'm doing in that moment? I'm elevating myself. I'm saying I am more righteous than that person. I have the more right perspective. And I totally forget about the covenant relationship that God wants to have with me, right? That's what we do. We do that every day. How do you do it? How do you guys do it? How does that look like for you? I think a lot of times we can identify with a Pharisee if we really just take the time to look at our own hearts. So let's look at the tax collector and see his response. Jesus is being really audacious here because if you guys remember about tax collectors, they are the scum of the earth, right? Jesus describes tax collectors as extortioners. These are people who worked for the enemy. They worked for Rome at that time. And so because they worked for Rome, they would take money from their own people and give it back to Rome so they could, again, oppress the Jewish people and have rule over them. So Jewish people did not look highly upon their own people who were tax collectors. And so so they were just not viewed great upon. And so this tax collector knew the kind of person that he was. And he stood far off, couldn't even walk into the temple. And he's beating his chest. That's a weird thing. Even for them, there's nowhere in the Old Testament does it say that. But even today, if you saw me just beating my chest over and over again, I mean, it's a weird kind of thing, right? They're like, why is this guy doing that? Like, why is he beating himself up, right? But he was so broken over his sin. He knew exactly what he was doing. And he says, God, have mercy on me. The Greek word that is used here for mercy is not the common word that they would use in the New Testament. It was actually a translation of the Septuagint, which is a translation of the Old Testament Hebrew word for atonement. And so what he's really asking God here is, God, have mercy on me to atone for my sin. Make me right with you again. I am so screwed up. The tax collector knew exactly who he was. He knew he messed up. He knows he's a screw up. He knows the kind of pain he caused other people. He knows that he's a sinner. He's fully aware of that. And he's beating his chest. And he's like, God, have mercy on me. God, have mercy on me. How often in our churches, how often do you come into church that broken? How often do you come in your relationship to God and look upon your sin in that way, where you're just broken of your own sin? When I look at that story, I think about that student. I mean, metaphorically, he was beating his chest, saying, God, there's no way you can forgive me for that. And I just wanted to cry. I was like, God, what do I say? I mean, I know he's wrong. But I know what I was going to say had to have an impact. And so what I told him was, and I'll close with this, is that there's no sin, and I think you guys heard me say this before, but there's no sin that God cannot forgive, that did not require Jesus dying on the cross. That's what I told him. He of course he'll forgive you because he died for you. You can't make it right. God made it right for you. And so, of course he can forgive you. And so my question for you guys as you are here is, where are you at? Are you coming in? I mean, probably some of you might come in like me, like kind of like the Pharisee in some ways. But when you really look at our own hearts, we're really like the tax collector if we think about the depth of our sin, right? There's none righteous, not even one. There's no one who does good. But when we think about that, we could laterally, that may not be true, but vertically, compared to a holy, perfect God, that is absolutely true. And there's nothing we can do to save us and to rescue us from that, from our own brokenness. But that's what God requires. That's the amazing thing here, is that Jesus offers the greatest reversal here. What makes you right with God is not doing good things. And God's not even in the business of even making you a good person. That's not Christianity at all. Christianity is about turning into a saved person, a rescued person. He's in the business of saying, look, it's not your goodness that saves you. It's actually the opposite. Because if you are humbled and broken over your sin, then you will be exalted. I will raise you up. But if you are exalted and see yourself like the Pharisee and put your goodness before God's, then I'm going to humble you. And he will one day. And so the question is, where are you? Where are you at in that? And so let's pray. Father God, I thank you so much for this parable. And I thank you that you are, it's short, but God, you do, there's a lot here. And even in this time, I couldn't even say everything, which I know I want to. But God, I pray right now that as we are here and as we're in this place, I pray that we can be okay, God, where we're at, that we can reflect upon the cross and reflect upon what you've done for us, Jesus, and know that you are the one that saves us and rescues us, and that you know who we are, and that it doesn't matter to you about our goodness, Lord, even our badness, Lord, but you still show us grace, you still show us mercy. So help us to see that. And I pray this in your name. Amen.